Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be the first of a series of probably 2-book wrap-ups that I'm going to do for March Mystery Madness. March Mystery Madness, if this is the first time you're hearing about it, is a month-long mystery-themed readathon that takes place every year in March. I will leave additional information down below, and I'll also link to my announcement video for this readathon. Since we just passed the first weekend of March Mystery Madness, I thought I would talk about the first 2 books that I read, both of which I had similar reactions to, in that I thought that both of these were quite good, quite entertaining, but not as great as they could have been. So the first of the 2 is a series that I've been calling Idyll something, so this one would be Idle Hands, except I've heard that it's actually pronounced Idyll, so I can't unhear it as Idyll though. If I mispronounce it that way, I apologize. I can't seem to stop myself. This series is actually called the Thomas Lynch series, and it follows a New York City cop who has retired from homicide in New York City and become the police chief of a small town in New England in the late 1990s. The series plays a bit with the idea of a big city cop moving to a small town where not a lot happens, where he's bored. It explores a bit what it means for this character as a gay man who has only just started being out of the closet in a public way. He's trying to figure out what that means for his public versus private life, especially in a small town where everyone knows your business. And because it has a late 90s setting, the author puts a lot of 1990s flavor into it. They talk a lot about the Star Wars prequels, which were just coming out. In this one in particular, they're talking a lot about the Y2K bug and are their computer systems all going to crash? I did have to mention something in my Goodreads review that drove me a little crazy, in that at one point, one character makes a Poirot joke that's clearly meant to refer to the David Suchet series, which used to air on Mystery, and the character comments, they must not watch Masterpiece Mystery. But that TV series wasn't called Masterpiece Mystery until the late 2000s. I think they changed it about 10 years ago. Throughout the 90s, that show was just called Mystery. So that took me out of it a little bit. Stephanie Gayle is old enough to have known that. So I think she's around the same age that I am, so shame. That is really minor. The past books in this series have been completely told through the eyes of the main character, Thomas Lynch. In this story, she mixes things up a bit by alternating the narration between him and one of his detectives. I found that to be really entertaining because it meant we got to see the town and also the police department through the eyes of someone who is a little more used to it, who has more pre-existing relationships, and we got to see more about those characters that wasn't just filtered through the eyes of this newcomer. So that was really interesting, and she also dealt with the issue of whenever you have a mystery series set in a small town, and then they keep having murders or other dramatic crimes, you start thinking, how sleepy is this small town that they keep having murders? But she got around to that by having the 2 characters be working on 2 parallel cold cases, both involving young women who had gone missing in the 1970s. One of whom is the detective's sister, and then another one that is just an incidental case. So both of those things I thought were great additions to the series, but the big problem with that is that she didn't really differentiate the voices. If one of them happened to be thinking about the problems in their lives, because the detective has a number of ex-wives, so occasionally he'd think about his ex-wives, and the main character in this series has a boyfriend who wants an open relationship and he doesn't want to deal with that. So if one of them were dealing with their ex-wife or their boyfriend, then you would know, okay, this is that character. But the voices in terms of style aren't differentiated, and I think they really should be, considering that the one character is from New York and the other one is originally from Boston. And you'd think there'd be a little bit more. You don't want to exaggerate on the dialect bit, but it really was a missed opportunity, because I genuinely a lot of the time had to flip back to the beginning of the chapter to figure out which one of those characters was talking, because unless they talked really explicitly about which crime they were working on, and again, because the 2 cases were so similar, that was sometimes hard to tell too. So even though in theory I really liked where she was going with this and taking the series in a slightly different direction, but it didn't 100% work. Now that said, my favorite thing about Stephanie Gayle's writing in this series has been the pacing. There are so many mysteries where the story just really goes off the rails at the end, and you get a decent build-up, and then it just sort of crash lands and you accept it because it's so common in the genre. But she really paces these out really well, and that continues here. So the flow of this was really entertaining. I read this in about 2 sittings, and it's not a short book. This is around 300 pages, so I think that really speaks to how well she engages you with the storytelling. The voices just could have been differentiate it a little bit more. But yeah, I was entertained, even if I didn't think this was 100% successful in everything that it tried to do. I had a very similar reaction to A Deadly Divide, which is the latest in Ausma Zehanat Khan's series about a pair of Toronto detectives, although in this volume they are in a small town in Quebec that is described as being an hour and a half out of Ottawa. It's clearly based on the situation in which a radicalized Quebecois man went and shot up a mosque in 2017. Because that case is so well known and so recent, I had wondered how this would play out, because it seems like if you change too much it would seem disrespectful of the actual situation, but if you don't change anything, how do you have the suspense of a procedural like this? And I think she did a pretty good job of balancing those things out. And there were a lot of individual elements that I liked in this. And I felt like in any other series that hadn't begun with a book like The Unquiet Dead, which I think really went above and beyond what a procedural like this really needs to do or has to do, I would think that this was very good. Because it has to kind of live up to the expectations that I had from that one, I was still a little disappointed, even though this was still entertaining and succeeded on most levels. I personally don't like the way this author writes romantic and romantic attraction type plots. I have the same problem with her fantasy series, where I like about 90% of it, but the 10% that is people being attracted to each other just really gets on my nerve, and there is more of that in here. Now, I think some people like the kind of idea of chemistry and that the main male detective is somehow super irresistible to almost all women in a weird way. So I know some people are kind of charmed by that, so if you like that, there's even more of it here. If you don't like that, as I don't, I was always disappointed whenever that came up. One of the things that I especially liked about The Unquiet Dead, which was the first book in the series, this is number 5, was that it didn't hold the reader's hand as it introduced issues and cultures. There were footnotes so you could look up the pieces that you didn't know, but there wasn't as much guiding of the audience of this is what this means, this is what that means in the text itself. Now, I have seen interviews with the author where she talks about meeting people at signings who tell her that they've never been out of the United States before, and these are set primarily in Canada, although there's been one that's set in Iran, and one that's going to come out later this year is set in Greece. So I understand to a certain extent why she wants to kind of explain some of these cultural elements to maybe her target demographic who maybe aren't as aware of the issues. And also the theme that that first novel was about was also the subject on which she wrote her PhD dissertation. So I think that was maybe a subject she was more used to writing about, so that made that flow a little bit better than the other one. I still think these are very good in terms of topical mysteries and being able to merge very serious current day issues with a police procedural. I just feel like when you have something so exceptional as the first one in the series, it's hard for anything else to live up to it. Since this does, to a certain extent, do this kind of educational factor now, I was disappointed by the number of times that we had comments where a character would say, so-and-so uttered a condolence in Arabic, or so-and-so cursed in French, and I wish they had included the actual condolences and the actual curses, so I thought that was a bit of a missed opportunity. And again, I feel like that's kind of hand-holding, that there are some people who don't like seeing language code switching, or sometimes even dialect code switching in popular fiction. But I think this is exactly the kind of story that can use that and that people would be able to deal with, so I think it's a shame that that's not in there. I also thought at the end there was one weird thing that stood out to me, just because I've had a number of friends who, when they got married, ended up having... In Canada, I know in a lot of countries, one would have both a civil and a religious wedding if one wanted to both be legally married and were religious enough for a ceremony. But in general in Canada, that's not true. Your religious ceremony will be your civil wedding. But I've had a number of friends who wanted to get married outside and have a Catholic wedding. So they had to do two because you can't have a Catholic wedding outside. Which I mentioned because there is a side point. It's basically the end of a misdirected plot at one point that's meant to distract you before you get to the meat of where we're going in the investigation. But at the end of one of these side plots, there is a Catholic wedding in the woods. And I thought, for a series that's generally so interested in digging down into culture and religion and whatnot, it was very odd to have that be a plot point of this you think the priest is doing something terrible, but here's a wedding in the woods. And I thought, but he can't have a wedding in the woods. So I thought that that was kind of poorly done, especially because this is something that I've heard so many people complain about. So I'm sure other people are familiar with the fact that that's a rule, so I thought that was a little bit lazy. As with the masterpiece mystery complaint in the other book, I think both of those are kind of minor complaints. I feel like this video has made me sound much more negative about both of those than I actually am, because I thought both of those were successful mysteries in that they were entertaining, in that I did not guess the whodunit piece, even though in one of them I genuinely was convinced that I had guessed whodunit by page 74 and I was wrong. These were both successful. I'm doing more complaining than I should. So if you're doing March Mystery Madness, how was your first weekend of mysteries? And I will post my next video of non-mystery reading in probably a day. Anyway, that's it for now. Ciao.